Hello, I'm James Shannon. Work for the Mississippi State University Extension Service. I'm forestry specialist in the Northeast District of the state. So that goes from down Noxubee County all the way up Benton, Marshall, over into Tishomingo. So our current issue is roots and resiliency, fostering forest stewardship in a canopy of change. So we're going to cover three main points. And climate change is the overarching current issue and how it is impacting forest management and the health of our forest. So we'll discuss just briefly the climate change and the causes. I'm sure y'all are all familiar with that. And look at the impacts of climate change on Mississippi forestry in terms of storms, drought, heat. And we'll give an example of how weather patterns and extreme weather impacted our health of our forest. And we'll talk about forest insects and diseases and how changing climate can impact that, and look at the vulnerability and assessments and how we can adapt to deal with that. So climate change, we know that, just to briefly talk about global warming, so we know that the sunshine, the sun's energy heats the Earth's surface, and some of that energy is reflected by the atmosphere. Some comes in, most is absorbed by the Earth, but then then greenhouse gases can trap some of that energy and keep it from escaping the atmosphere, which can impact and warm our Earth. So climate change impacts. So increasing seasonal temperatures and changing precipitation patterns. So the impact is warmer winters, wetter springs, hot, dry summers, and longer growing seasons. So the growing season is the length of time when plants can grow, and that increases the opportunities for impacts. So extreme weather events that have impacted Mississippi: heat waves, droughts, heavy rainfall, because as you know, warmer air can hold more water vapor. So that increases heavy downpour events that can have an impact, and hurricanes. So when we have warmer ocean temperatures, that creates conditions that are ripe for a large, powerful hurricane to develop, which can impact our state. So climate impacts. So extreme weather events can stress our trees and make them susceptible to insects and diseases. And these pictures, so we'll explain the drought monitor, but that depicts extreme drought events, which can impact wildfires and the health of our trees. Storms can cause damage to the trees, which can make them susceptible to insects. So to relate all this, we'll talk about an event that happened in 2023. So our drought monitor map, so that comes out every Thursday, and this was from mid-September or late September of 2023. In the maroon color, that's extreme drought, exceptional drought. Just keep in mind the areas that are listed here, and then on the coast. And the pictures on the other side depict how hot and dry it was. Because you can look at that map and you say, well, we've had droughts before, and it really wasn't a big deal. It was dry, and then we ended up getting rains and no problem. The difference in this situation was not only were we getting record lack of rainfall, we were getting record temperatures. And so you can see that those record temperatures that were listed were all above 100 degrees throughout that time period of August and September. And you remembered where that exceptional drought was listed there. Look, this was aerial imagery, satellite imagery from U.S. Forest Service and Mississippi Forestry Commission. In the area in yellow here, those are areas of dead pine trees. So over 80,000 acres in the southwest part of the state, so that's about 12.5 million trees. That the impact was from just heat and drought. So those trees were not getting enough water, so they died. Or wildfires. So when it's exceptionally dry, any spark can create a big problem. And insects, mainly Ips beetles. And we'll talk about other bark beetles, but in this situation, it was devastating. And if you've been in Jackson, there's dead pine trees everywhere, and they're having issues in people's yards, and then in the forest. So it had a major impact on our forest industry and the health of the trees. So we'll first talk about the insects, and in the current events, we have 4 insects that were listed there, so we'll make sure that we discuss them. So southern pine beetles, traditionally, that is the most influential pest we've got. Ips and graver beetles, so this situation, we're talking about the drought, I'll refer back to that several times. Emerald ash borer is a new pest that has not been documented. And red bay ambrosia beetle, which is here and causing damage. So bark beetles. So when you see a dead pine tree, that's going to be the first thing you think that, well, that's a pine beetle. But we've got 5 different species of pine bark beetles in Mississippi. And each of those insects start their attacks in a certain area of the tree. So black turpentine beetle is towards the base. And southern pine beetle, think back using the Biltmore stick. So about 1 log up in the tree, that's going to be where they concentrate their attacks. In Ips and graver beetles, there's 3 different species of those. And the first, the 6-spined, is a little bit above southern pine beetle, and the others kind of dominate the top and then the branches of the tree. So issues that lead to extreme outbreak can be drought, because we'll explain how trees or pines have a defense system to help protect against beetle attacks, but if they don't have enough water, that limits how much that they can resist. Storm damaged trees, they can often create the situation where an epidemic or a large outbreak can occur, and overly dense, slow growing trees. And those trees, when they're dense and overpopulated, it slows down their growth. They become less vigorous, and they can't resist the bark beetle attacks. So we'll start with southern pine beetle. So one of the things that you look at when you're identifying this is the rear end. It's a rounded rear end. And also look at the size of the insect that we're talking about. So on the right here is black turpentine beetle. That's the largest one. and that in the middle is a grain of rice. So about half the size of a little grain of rice. But when you get millions of these working together, they can cause a lot of problems. So southern pine beetle is the most destructive pest in our southern forest, and the scientific name is in Latin is tree killer. So that fairly well sums it up. So it's a native pest, so they've got natural enemies, insects and disease, so their populations kind of go in cycles. So the population will build up, and then as that population builds up, then the beneficial insects, their population builds up. So then at a certain point, they meet, and then the southern pine beetle population crashes. And then we wait for another major outbreak. And if conditions are right, the population can increase rapidly, and you can have an outbreak that can last a couple or 2 or 3 years, and that can be substantial economic losses. And tying back into climate change, southern pine beetle, where does that tell you that this insect has predominantly lived? In the South. But there have been documented cases in New Jersey and Connecticut of the southern pine beetle. So as those conditions are right, then they've expanded their range, which could be drawn back to climate change. All right, so these are the examples of what you can find when you're looking to diagnose if a tree has southern pine beetles. The galleries, these are where the adults are feeding. And think S for southern pine beetle, and you look, these are kind of S-shaped galleries. So just kind of the female meanders around in that tree. And I talked about that trees need to be vigorous to be able to withstand an attack. This is a pitch tube. And you can see that is where the tree is using its sap to actually push those beetles out. And so you can see a little beetle that has been pushed out. But if you don't have enough rainfall, then that tree can't produce the sap it needs to be able to push those beetles out. And this is another example on the left-hand side here of the galleries. But there's 2 galleries. I want you to notice this straight line one right here. We'll refer back to that. That's an ips. So sometimes those beetles can exist in the same tree, and so they're causing damage on that individual. And down here is a cross section of a tree that is blue stained fungi. And so that is another way that beetles are attacking it, because on the female will have that fungus on her body, and as she is feeding on that, the inside in the cambium layer, y'all know what the cambium layer is, the inner bark, and also the phloem, that inner bark where all the sap and where the nutrients and sugars are, that's where those beetles are getting their energy. But, so on the inside, that is the sapwood. So that fungus is growing in there, and it naturally clogs up the sapwood. So there again, you're not getting that water flow, so that tree can't push out those beetles. So it's kind of the 1-2 punch. So, and those trees will succumb. The beetles, the adults will lay their eggs, and you get a new generation, and those populations grow to the point when they can have a major outbreak. So prevention is managing our forest, thinning out those stands. So we mainly, in those stands that are probably 15 to 20 years old, you need to harvest those trees. You can make several products from pulp and paper. You can make engineered oriented strand board. All those things that are forest products that can be helpful. Plus, by harvesting those trees, you're allowing that stand to be vigorous and healthy and withstand insect outbreaks. And in appropriate sites, particularly in southern part of Mississippi, longleaf pine can be an option to be able to plant, or slash pine. But thinning, as it opens it up, there's airflow, sunlight reaches the forest floor. The females, the way that they communicate with the other beetles to tell them, this is a tree, here I am, y'all come to me. She produces a pheromone, a scent, that it creates a trail or a message center for them to follow. But when you open up that stand, the wind kind of can disrupt that, and then the emerging beetles can have a harder time finding another host. So it solves a couple of different situations when you open that stand up. But this is a picture of a southern pine beetle attack. You've got 3 stages. These are the dead trees here. Stage 2, those are trees that the adults are starting to emerge. And then stage 1, that is going to be where they've just started their attack. The females are making those galleries and lay their eggs. So to control southern pine beetle, you've got to act. You can't wait around because those attacks continue to grow. So we can salvage removal, that is harvesting those trees before they decay to the point, or where you've got the blue stain fungi that we talked about that can lower the economic and lower the value of those trees. Cut and leave, that we talked about the stand. So cut and leave, you would make sure you would cut a buffer zone around that beetle spot, and you just leave those trees there, because southern pine beetle cannot live in trees that have been cut down. And you can pile those trees up and burn them. But the main thing is very effective to not go through that burning process, is you can fell those trees toward the center of that spot and control the outbreak. Current issue, our neighbor to the east, Alabama, is having a major southern pine beetle outbreak this last year, so it is concern for us this year. And in the eastern counties, especially in the northern part of the state, Monroe, Etowah, Tishomingo, they have had some outbreaks there this growing season. But as temperatures get to be above 50 degrees, then those females can become active. So in the springtime, we will be able to understand what we're up against. So one way that our forestry specialists can monitor the impact of southern pine beetle is by trapping. And these will be put throughout the state, and they are baited with turpentine, which is a oil from the pine sap that attracts those beetles. They can count the number that they catch and determine the populations, or predict what the populations will be. So we'll change gears to Ips and graver beetles. So we talked about there's 3 species in the south, and they attack stressed trees. And large spots are uncommon, and you can see here, normally it's a checkerboard pattern throughout the pine stand. There'll be 1 or 2 trees here, or a group of 4 or 5 trees all the way through there. And they're looking for the most stressed trees, the trees that are not healthy. But as in certain and extreme situations, like we talked about the drought in 2023, then it led to a large outbreak where the beetles were impacting entire stands, entire areas. And one of the things that we found was that the extreme heat, that it would shut down the development of southern pine beetle. When it would get above 100 degrees, then they could not complete their life cycle. But they did not bother the Ips and graver beetles at all. It actually encouraged them because you have more damaged trees, and they were able to build their populations and cause a lot of damage. So remember the round back end of the southern pine beetle? The Ips have a concave back end, and you can see these spines. So that's where you can count the number of spines to determine what species of Ips you're dealing with. So Ips, think about I, like a straight line, because you can have like X's or H's, but the main factor is you're looking for a straight line where that female is feeding. And she lays her eggs on the sides of the galleries, and you can see these little squiggly lines. That's the larvae that is feeding. And as that larva gets bigger, the size of that gallery increases. So Ips prevention through thinning to open up those stands so you reduce the number of trees that are stressed. And when you're logging, remove all damaged trees, and you scatter the slash. Slash are the limbs and needles that are left when they harvest, so they will take those and spread them throughout the stand, because those Ips can actually feed in those that slash that is left. So it's important to spread them out, and the skidders and equipment will run over them and start the decomposition process, and so the Ips don't have areas where they can feed. And trees, when they're stressed, those trees that are the most stressed, once they're attacked and die, then their susceptible host decreases and the threat will stop. But we talked about that you do a cut and leave operation in southern pine beetle. If you did that with Ips, you're just creating a buffet, because those beetles will be attracted to those trees that have been cut down. And one example in Lincoln County, I saw some pictures where on a logging site on Friday afternoon, they had trees that were left there, and they were going to load the truck the next Monday. When the logger came back, there were Ips beetles everywhere. Ips beetles, a picture of him all over his shirt, so it just attracted more beetles, and that was an example of how that outbreak was above normal levels for sure. So emerald ash borer, so that is a non-native pest from Asia that came over more than likely in shipping crates or materials around 2002. So this insect has killed millions of ash trees throughout the Northeast and other parts of the state, and primarily is transported through firewood. There'd be dead ash trees. They would cut those down. Somebody would go on a camping trip. They said, well, this is laying here. I'll just take this wood. Well, they were unknowingly taking the larvae and the adults to new locations. So this spread tremendously throughout the United States. We don't have a documented case in Mississippi, but it's likely here. This could be the year that we finally are able to pinpoint, because we're surrounded. There's emerald ash borer in Louisiana, Arkansas, and Alabama. So it's just a matter of time. So but there's only one generation a year, but you can see the size of another small insect that can cause tremendous damage. So early detection is very important. So that is where you guys knowing your trees and knowing how to identify an ash tree. So if you see those, and you can report that to the Extension Service or Mississippi Forestry Commission. And they've got the exit holes where the adults come out of the tree are like D-shaped. So if you start to see those problems, then you can alert the Extension Service or Mississippi Forestry Commission. But cut those trees down and burn that to and destroy the larvae and the adults. There are preventive insecticide treatments, but they can be very expensive. They're not practical in a forest setting. Red bay ambrosia beetle. So similar time period, I started noticing dead red bay trees in Georgia around Savannah. And then in 2009, noticed that in Jackson County on the coast. Well, they were attacking the red bay trees, but also anything in that family, which includes sassafras, which originally that's where root beer came from, but also avocados, so that's going to be a big issue as well. So mainly those is transferred through moving firewood again, or wood for specialty projects. And the females will vector a laurel wilt disease, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we transfer into the disease portion. There's no effective treatments for this, so just like we talked about with the emerald ash borer, do not move firewood. So we'll go into the disease portion. The diseases that can impact our trees and health in Mississippi. Needle blight, laurel wilt, which we mentioned just a second ago, and almond malaria, root rot. So needle blight. So beginning about 2016, foresters started noticing trees that were turning brown, pine trees in the lower canopy, and it was moving up. And we were getting a lot of calls from landowners saying, I think I've got pine beetles. Will you come check? Well, the big difference is pine beetles would not be active at that same time period. Plus, pine beetle attack, the whole tree would turn red and die. Or you can think about it happening from the top down. Well, needle blight happens from the bottom up. There's about 5 different species of fungal diseases that can cause this. They infect the needles, and those the second year needles. So pine trees have needles that grow in the current year, and then the second year needles continue to grow, and then they fall off at the end of that growing season. So repeated infections can cause those trees to become stressed, and when they're stressed, what else can happen? So you got a stressed tree, what can happen? That is, they can encourage an outbreak of bark beetles. And it can slow the growth and cause issues there. Not all loblolly pine trees or families are susceptible, but we're doing research to be able to determine the exact causes. So we had 5 different types of fungal diseases that can impact our needle blight, but brown spot needle blight is the biggest problem. So historically, it was just a problem in longleaf pine, which grows in southern Mississippi. And it would be in the grass stage of that. So this small sapling there And the way that you can control that is through prescribed burning. So burning those needles would consume the pathogen, and those trees will continue to grow no problem. But in around 2016, 2017, we started noticing issues in loblolly pine. It had never been like that before. So researchers are currently determining what is caused that. Is it a genetic mutation of the brown spot needle blight? Is it impacted by our changing weather, wet springs, which encourage fungal disease growth? And how do we control this? So Dr. John Riggins at Mississippi State is looking at does prescribed burning help control that pathogen? Others are looking at other universities in the South are looking at other ways to control that. So laurel wilt disease. So the red bay ambrosia beetles, there's lots of different examples of ambrosia beetles, and you may have noticed trees that they'll have, especially smooth bark trees, little toothpicks sticking out from the trunk. Well, that is when that beetle is feeding, they continue to pack the sawdust where they feed, and it'll actually stick out of the tree. And that is what this is in this picture there. But as the beetle is feeding in there, they are inoculating that tree with the laurel wilt fungus. And the larvae do not feed on the tree itself, they're feeding on that fungus that is in there. And that causes this dark area there in the sapwood of that tree. So it kills the tree. So armillaria root rot. So they can attack drought stressed trees and root rot part. That's where they're going to build their population, and the fungal growth will eventually weaken that tree and cause it to blow over in a windstorm, become impacted. So the main way that you can diagnose that is the copper colored mushrooms that are growing at the base and feeding on the root of the tree. So vulnerability assessments and adaptation, because we know that we're having the extreme weather events that can impact our forest, but we're vulnerable from overstocked pine stands because of poor pulpwood markets. So pulpwood are going to be the smaller trees that come from the thinnings to open up those stands. But our markets, we're growing about 2 times as much wood that we're harvesting. So we're growing a lot more than we're utilizing. So there's many stands throughout Mississippi that are not being thinned in a timely manner. So they're stressed and can be impacted by those extreme weather events, which could be an offshoot of climate change. So adaptation, thinning overstock stands will make them more vigorous and be able to be not as susceptible to outbreaks of southern pine beetle and other insects and other disease issues. And one example, the USDA Forest Service is currently doing a timber production expansion guarantee loan program. So that's providing loans for forest industry to be able to start to develop mills that can use wood from national forest or federal lands, so they can be well managed and vigorous, so to prevent issues with disease outbreaks, wildfire, or other catastrophic events. So in conclusion, climate change could be impacting the insects and disease outbreaks, primarily in Mississippi, is going to be from extreme weather events such as drought and storms that can weaken trees and make them susceptible. So while climate change is not directly causing those issues, it is weakening the trees and making where we could have outbreaks such as in 2023 during that summer. So southern pine beetle, brown spot needle blight, Ips beetles are all things that we need to be aware of in the future.